after which I'm even more convinced that I'm in the right place. I was convinced of that anyway before the introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here in Brazil, in Sao Paulo. In this institute, I had the pleasure of meeting the president, Fernando Henrique Cardoso, on Sunday before he left. I've been a great admirer of his work. And indeed, I like to say, ich bin ein Berliner. But I mean an Isaiah Berliner, not a West Berliner, as Kennedy liked to put it, and perhaps I'm among Berliner here too. I frankly am here in Brazil as much to listen as to talk, to learn as to teach, because, as you will see, I want to hear Brazilian voices and Brazilian views on the subject I want to lay before you. But in order to lead into that, let me make a few remarks about my subject, which I've called rather portentously the world crisis of democratic leadership and how Brazil can help to address it. Let me start with the problem and then proceed to open a discussion about the solution. I mean, you remember that Isaiah Berlin's favorite author, Alexander Herzen, once famously observed, "In general, modern man has no solutions," which I think is a fair comment, but nonetheless, we keep trying to look for them. Why do I think there is a crisis in leadership in world affairs? Who is setting the agenda? Who has the instruments capable effectively of realizing that agenda? Let me mention a few elements in that crisis. The first is, let me put it rather sharply, that I would submit that as a single, coherent geopolitical actor, the West has ceased to exist. The West no longer exists. Let me be clear what I mean by that. I do not mean Western civ, the heritage of culture, of history, of thought, of Jerusalem, Athens, and Rome, of the Renaissance and the Reformation and the Enlightenment, of everything one would learn in a classic course of Western civ. Western civ is very much present in very many places, indeed places far beyond the traditional West. I mean specifically the West as a coherent, effective, powerful geopolitical actor. And if you look at the West in that narrower sense, it actually has not existed for thousands of years. In this narrower sense, one could argue that it's only existed in rather limited periods. One would be very brief, 1917 to 1918, when you had a sort of Anglo-French-American West as a coalition in the First World War, fighting, of course, against another part of Western civilization, against Germany. The second would be in the Second World War, initially, as it were, an Anglo-French-led West, then with the United States and several other allies, including, of course, Brazil, but again, in the context of a civilizationally divided West. It was a war of the West against the West. The only period in which this West, also known as the free world, had a sustained existence was, of course, during the Cold War. For more than 40 years, there was an effective geopolitical actor. at its core an alliance, a transatlantic alliance between Western Europe and North America, but with what has been called a greater West of other allies in Latin America, in Australasia, and elsewhere. At the end of the Cold War, Owen Harris, then the editor of The National Interest, the journal, wrote an actually rather prescient article entitled, I think, The End of the West, in which he said, essentially like so many other alliances, this alliance, this geopolitical West, was kept together by the common enemy, the Soviet Union, the Communist East. With the disappearance of the common enemy, we should expect the disappearance of that alliance, as has happened with most alliances in history. And sure enough, that is, I think, what has happened. It was already beginning to happen visibly in the 1990s, but was not fully apparent, partly because of the character of the Clinton administration, which was a profoundly Europeanist and indeed in some senses European administration. The neocons like to say that Bill Clinton was a European. That was not a compliment for them, at least, although I think it was, and he might think it was. And there was a lot of truth in that. He was of that, perhaps the last generation of American leaders who had studied in Europe, who knew Europe intimately, who felt themselves to be committed to an idea of Europe. And Madeleine Albright was, of course, genuinely a European. I mean, she was a Czech, and felt herself very much to be so. And they, of course, made the NATO enlargement to Eastern Europe, the European Union following the leadership of NATO. And that, in a sense, that habitual Europeanism of the Clinton administration obscured the deeper historical trends, which were then exposed brutally. Firstly, by the arrival of the Bush administration, arguably the most nationalist and unilateralist American administration for many years, possibly for decades, and then by the impact of 9/11 and the Iraq crisis, which of course provoked a crisis of the West, a split in the Atlantic Alliance, a split in Europe. Some people like to argue that the so-called global war on terror, the GWAT in Washington speak, or as others like to put it, the confrontation with Islamofascism, will have the uniting functions that to some extent the Second World War, but even more the Cold War, had. This seems to me implausible, because the perception of the threat is very different in Europe and the United States. The perception of the threat is very different, and the reality of the threats, and I think we have to say that in the plural, is actually very different between the impacts in a Europe which has some 20 to 30 million Muslim inhabitants, depending how you count, and which is right next door to the Middle East, and the impact in the United States. So actually I don't think that that particular threat, which is only one of the threats we face in the world, is going to pull together these core components of the traditional geopolitical West, if anything, the reverse. Moreover, in Europe itself, you have a very strong current of what I call Euro-Gaullism. Euro-Gaullism. Gaullism on a European scale, in which we attempt to find our European identity, what unites us, in contradistinction to the United States. Something which will be not unfamiliar to you, perhaps, in South America. That is to say, absent the Soviet communist other or enemy, which was a defining other of the European project, not just of the transatlantic project, for 40 years. If you look to the early history of the European integration, it's very much as an answer to the Soviet threat. And given the complexity of any definition of Europe against Islam, although we could talk about that, there is a major temptation to define Europe as the not America. And I have quite a lot in this book, Free World, about those attempts and their inherent implausibility. A second reason why I would argue that we face this crisis of organization in the world system is an even larger historical trend. I think, painting with a broad brush, one could argue that we are at the end of a period of what one might call Western supremacy in world historical terms, which lasted, roughly speaking, from the 21st of April 1500, a date that may be familiar to some of you, when Pedro Cabral made landfall in Portugal, more broadly, from the great age of European expansion across the oceans, to, roughly speaking, 2000, 2001, painting with a broad brush. In this period, the West became and remained the major locus of modernity and of power. The West, broadly speaking, was able to dictate the agenda of world politics, although we have to recall that as late as 1800, more than half the world's manufacturing capacity was in fact in China. It was really only in the 19th and 20th century that this supremacy was unchallenged. But we've become so used to the West being the locus of power, economic and military and modernity, that we forget that it was not ever thus and will not always be thus. And even now, we are experiencing one of those great world historical shifts, above all with what I like to call the renaissance of the Far East, the re-emergence of China and India as great powers, but also with other powers, of which, of course, Brazil is notably one. We all know the famous BRICS acronym and the study by Goldman Sachs. And within the foreseeable future, and I think that future may be upon us sooner than many certainly in Washington appreciate, the West, even understood as a unity of action between Western Europe or North America, or the whole of Europe and the whole of the Americas, will not be able to dictate the agenda of world politics in the way that it has for centuries. The legacy of that period is, of course, what Theodor von Lauer, in a rather interesting book, which some of you will know, called The World Revolution of Westernization. That is to say that there is no society in the world, or virtually no major society in the world, which has been untouched by transformations to do with Western ways of doing things, although they have, of course, themselves transmogrified and adapted those Western ways of doing things. The third major reason why I think we face this crisis is this very familiar phenomenon that we are all talking about, called globalization. Of course, we then have to ask what we mean by that very fashionable term. A British academic once made a collection of definitions of globalization. He found, I think, 57 different definitions of globalization, 9 of them from Anthony Giddens at the NSE. which, for those of you who know Anthony Giddens' work, is an interesting reflection. But nonetheless, we sort of know what we're talking about. It is a qualitative growth in both the density and the depth of transnational interactions of many kinds, financial and economic in the first place. That is self-evident, and is, I suppose, the primary sense of globalization. Environmental, self-evidently, we now understand that environmental issues, as you said in your introduction, are by their nature transnational. Social, there is the beginnings of something one might call a transnational civil society. International NGOs are significant actors. Cultural, certainly, and cultural particularly because of the globalization of media, the phenomenon of CNN, of 24/7 real-time coverage. So there are actually, for the first time in world history, genuinely global events which people all over the world are following on real time on television. Maybe 3 billion people are following those events, and even more, of course, with the arrival of the internet and the web. 9/11 was obviously a global event. Curious enough, I think the death of Princess Diana was a fairly global event. I mean, not all global events are actually important in political terms. And of course, the World Cup is the ultimate global event. What there is not, what is characteristic of our time, is the globalization of governance, your subject, the political globalization, to match those other dimensions of globalization, economic, social, cultural, media globalization. And this is, I think, the challenge we face, the search for forms of global governance that are commensurate with those other dimensions of globalization. The fourth and final major reason I want to give for suggesting that we face this crisis, and of course the list is not comprehensive, you could add more, is an attempt to find an answer to it, which is the attempt made by the United States in the last, 7 years, roughly speaking, to give an answer which was that we now live not in a multipolar or bipolar world, but in a unipolar world in which the United States was the sole superpower, the hyperpower, and it itself would set the agenda of world politics, a view celebrated by the conservative columnist Charles Krauthammer as the new unilateralism. The new unilateralism, a column, incidentally, and the date is important, which appeared in the Washington Post on the 8th of June 2001. That is to say, this approach clearly predates 9/11. The Bush administration came in already with that approach, really, and practiced it in relation, as you yourselves will have found, but certainly as we found in relation to Europe, a very, very different approach. Krauthammer wrote that after a decade of Prometheus playing pygmy, now it was Prometheus unbound, and the United States should feel free to pursue its own national interests with an assumption of American hegemony, and with military power in particular, which had been built up to be, and this is a formula from the first national security strategy of the Bush administration, I quote, beyond challenge. Beyond challenge. Ladies and gentlemen, it seems to me that we can say now with confidence that this approach has already failed. I am, at the moment, I spend most of my life at Oxford, but part of each year, 3 months each year at Stanford, where I catch up each year with the change in the American debate. And I've just gone back to the United States, been there for a month. It's a dramatic change in the terms of the American debate. The acknowledgement, and I'm based, by the way, at the Hoover Institution, which is not a left liberal institution, which is in many ways a very conservative institution. The change even in conservative Republican thinking, the acceptance that this approach has in fact failed and that you have to look for other approaches to American leadership in world affairs. In fact, you can trace that change already to the beginning of the second term of George W. Bush. If you look at the way in which, particularly the State Department under Condi Rice, came in with a demonstratively new approach, emphasizing diplomacy, what she called transformative diplomacy, emphasizing alliances. Bush went in February 2005, spoke in Brussels, visited the European Union. First American president actually to do that. It's interesting that Clinton, for all his Europeanism, didn't actually visit the European Union, so Bush did. So there were the beginnings of an approach, but with the failure in Iraq, and one can say with, I think, what the Germans call an Sicherheit grenzende Wahrscheinlichkeit, near certainty, that it is indeed already the failure in Iraq, the failure to achieve the stated objectives, a failure by the most powerful military in the history of the world, with a military budget this year of $600 billion. $600 billion. I have here a slightly grainy photocopies that you have in front of me from my last book, which are these sort of block charts of the elements of power. And if you look at on the first page, arms, military expending, you can see that overwhelming block of American military power. In 2002, the United States spent more on defense than the next 18 biggest defense spenders. That is before the increases of spending under the Bush administration. Then it was about $400 billion, now it's $600 billion. For all that absolute predominance of military power, the United States is losing the first major war on which it has been engaged since Vietnam. When young officers came into the Pentagon in the 1970s, they were told, no more Vietnams. I spoke to a Marine colonel at the Hoover Institution a few days ago, and he said, I think the people coming into the Pentagon today will be hearing no more Iraqs. It is a truly shocking defeat in which, by the way, no one should take any pleasure at all. But I think it is a defeat, not just in terms of the stated objectives of the Iraq War, but even in terms of the much more modest objectives which are now being embraced. We can talk about that in discussion, but what is quite clear is that come 2009, with the next American administration, we will have to see a different approach, and the question will be what that approach will be. Let me add that there is also a very good chance that in 2009 the European Union will finally, after endless birth pangs, the longest labor in the history of the European Union, have an institutional treaty. No longer a constitution, but an institutional treaty which gives more significant powers to a permanent president of the European Council and the High Representative for Foreign Policy. So a new administration in Washington and a new possibility in Brussels for the shaping of a more coherent European foreign policy. And with that, I turn to the second part of what I want to say, which is then to start thinking about possible solutions to this crisis. And let me say once again that I'm talking about solutions in terms of an operational community, not some broader understanding of Western civilization and a transition to universal civilization, of Western values in relation to universal values, although I would just draw your attention in passing to the second page of this handout, which is the really very interesting mapping of empirical mapping in the World Values Survey. And I mean, one can argue about the value of such exercises, about the definitions of terms, but the important point, and I think it's borne out by other survey material, is that leaving aside the normative question about the nature of Western or universal values, empirically, there is a complex map. There is a complex map of values in which there is no clear, discrete set of European values as opposed to American values, which is what many European thinkers like Habermas or Derrida would like to claim, that there is a distinctive, coherent set of European values as against American values. Not so, particularly if you disaggregate the so-called red and blue United States, the liberal and conservative United States. And as you can see, Latin America here, the English-speaking world, South Asia, there is, empirically speaking, a complex map of that. Okay, but turning back to the operational question, what might be done? Very briefly, and these really in the sense of headings for discussion. First of all, we could talk about reforming existing institutions. The institutions of the post-Second World War, international liberal order, shaped essentially by the United States, the United Nations. We could talk, if you want, about UN reform, a very complex and difficult subject. Of course, the key to it would be to change the permanent membership of the UN Security Council. Brazil is, of course, the leading candidate from South America, but you know as well as I do how difficult that reform will be to bring about and what the resistance is. I think myself, smaller reforms of the procedure and practices of the United Nations and its agencies are arguably as important and arguably certainly more doable. The IMF, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, NATO, in each case we could talk about possible reforms. One reform has been made in the post-Cold War world, which I regard as rather regrettable. There used to be something called the G7. There's now something called the G8, which recently met, as you know, in Germany. This is a legacy of the Clinton administration, of the Clinton-Yeltsin years, when the hope was that Russia would become one of the world's leading democracies. And I can understand why it was done, but the result is that in what is now a very important agenda-setting club of the world's richest democracies, you have one member which is one of the world's richest dictatorships, because Putin's Russia is by no stretch of any credible definition to be called a democracy today. You could at a very great stretch argue that it has observes the formalities of electoral democracy, but it's certainly not a liberal democracy in any fuller definition. And I regard that as a regrettable change, because being a good Kantian and believing in the importance in foreign policy of the quality of democracy, I think that's a pity. Secondly, we could talk about new institutions that might find their place in the organization of the international system. One of them, of course, Brazil plays a leading part in, the G20. And I'd be interested to hear views in this room about the potential of the G20 to be more than a rather specific organization for the trade and development agenda, and whether people think that it has a significant political potential. One major innovation in the post-Cold War world, and I think a very positive one, is the International Criminal Court. A very significant element of, if you will, legal or judicial globalization, an extension of international humanitarian law. It is a remarkable fact that the war criminals and authors of crimes against humanity in former Yugoslavia, from Slobodan Milosevic to a very prominent Croatian general, not just Serbs but also Kosovar Albanians, are sitting in The Hague in front of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. That I regard as a highly desirable and important development. So I think that's one very positive development. I would argue that the development of the European Union in the last 15 years is a change not just of quantity, and by the way, some change of quantity, from 12 to 27 members, from 320 million to about 460, going on 470 million people, but also a change of quality, that in the succession of treaties from the Treaty of Maastricht to the treaty whose outlines were agreed in Brussels last weekend, you do have a qualitative change in the nature of the organization. That the European Union now has the capacity to be a coherent actor, as it is already in trade talks, in development policy, in competition policy, but potentially also in foreign and security policy. There is also an organization called the Community of Democracies, which exists, as some of you will be aware, which has a sort of informal secretariat, which had a meeting in Santiago, I think 2 years ago, is meeting this year in Mali. I think it's a very nice idea, but I'm not convinced that in that institutional form, with a very extensive membership, and it has a very extensive, I think it's 123 now, it's a very extensive membership with, Russia, for example, is a member. France is not. It's a curious composition. I'm not convinced that it is capable of becoming a key operational element in the new international order, the formalized, institutionalized community of democracies. We could talk about that in discussion. It's an idea, by the way, which is playing a role in the American presidential debates. John McCain gave his sort of keynote foreign policy speech at Stanford earlier this year, and his central idea was what he called the League of Democracies, that once upon a time there was a League of Nations, That didn't do very well, but now we need a league of democracies. Others talk of a concert of democracies, with a very strong element and emphasis upon American leadership. I don't know what views are around this room, but I must say I'm not sure that the world at the moment is necessarily ready, just at this particular moment, for a new proposal, for a new league of democracies to be instituted and led by the United States. There was such a moment after 1945. I don't think we're in such a moment in the world I described for us. So what then is the way forward for those of us who do believe, as liberal internationalists and Kantians, that the category of democracy is a very important category in international relations? I think it is indeed Kantian. I think it is to think of a Kantian ideal of a community of democracies with a small c and a small d, not a large c and a large d, as our long-term goal. In this book, I argue that our strategic goal should be to move from what we used to call the free world. That was the old Atlantic Alliance plus a few friendly dictatorships. You remember that Jean Kirkpatrick thought Pinochet's Chile was part of the free world. The free world which no longer exists. The old Cold War West, which is finished, towards the ideal of a free world. Towards the ideal of a free world, in which in principle we hope everywhere to move towards a world of liberal democracies, but liberal democracies guaranteeing a certain socio-economic minimum without which liberal democracy is à la longue unsustainable. I like to say, paraphrasing Churchill, that never in the course of human history has a shift from the definite to the indefinite article been so important. From the to a. And the concomitant of that is, of course, that I think we end up talking less about the West, because as the West, in its basic practices, has gone so far beyond the historic West, it has put itself in question as a category. And indeed one could argue, I don't want to become too dialectical here, that the ultimate strategic goal of the West should be that the West no longer needs to exist, that it should be, to put it in Hegelian terms, aufgehoben. The question, though, returning to the Earth at a more terrestrial and empirical level, is what does this mean in operational terms to talk about a Kantian ideal? Well, first of all, it obviously doesn't mean that you don't deal with Russia or China, because it's self-evident that in a multipolar world you have to deal with other great powers. And if you look, for example, at the diplomacy around Iran, it's very interesting to me how little the United States and the European Union working together are able to achieve without involving Russia and China. Russia, the great oil giant itself, China, the great oil and gas consumer, which has signed multi-billion-dollar contracts with Iran, meaning that Iran has somewhere else to go. And so if you compare the diplomacy around Iraq with the diplomacy around Iran, you can see the shift that has already taken place to multipolarity. So we have to deal with the major non-democratic great powers and try and influence them. But nonetheless, I would argue that our preference, our default, our Kantian default setting should be always to start by looking for the democratic partners, and this is, of course, an approach that the Club of Madrid has encouraged, both in the sense of democracy promotion, but also in the sense of the multilateral cooperation of democracies. Now, viewed from where I sit, either in Oxford or Stanford, in London or Washington, it's obviously the case that you tend to start in practice by looking at the European Union and the United States. That's where you tend to start. But I think it's rather old thinking to believe that you finish there as well. And I talked a few weeks ago to Tony Blair, looking back at the balance sheet of his 10 years of foreign policy, which I think is, apart from Iraq, quite an impressive balance sheet. But he said, when I put this idea to him, he said, you know, in my practical experience, you always start with Europe and America. You build out from there. And I think, again, if you look at the block charts of power here, it's not just a preponderance of military power, to the extent that that's a usable resource in North America and Europe. It's also the concentration of economic power, which, by the way, is not soft power. This is a misuse of the term. Soft power is the power to attract. It's a cultural and social power. It's not economic power. Economic power is pretty hard power. The fact is, something like 60% of the world's GDP is still concentrated in North America and Europe. That's a fact. That's an operational fact. But it's a diminishing fact. And in the perspective, the BRICS perspective, it will be less so. Moreover, I think that if you are attempting to achieve goals of a transformative, of an environmental, of a developmental, of a trade kind, key partners will be the major democracies in other regions of the world, outside the old Cold War West. I mean, this seems to me a really important lesson. So that, for example, in our relations with the wider Middle East, the key strategic partner is Turkey. Turkey. The only consolidated major, large, secular democracy with a majority Muslim population, and just next door to Europe, between Europe and the wider Middle East. Key strategic partner. Because Indonesia is important too, but it's in a different place. In South Asia, and I think American policy is beginning to wake up to this, the key partner is without question the world's largest democracy, India. And all of us, I think, certainly in Europe, we pay, even in Britain I have to say, we pay much too little attention to India as a future strategic partner. And in the Southern Hemisphere, I would want to argue that Brazil should indeed be a key strategic partner as the major democracy, the most important democracy in South America. And this is actually where I want to end and to throw it open to discussion, because what I would like to hear from you or to discuss with you is how you would see, if you accept the framework I've laid out in broad terms, how you would see Brazil understanding itself as a world player, understanding itself as a player in such an informal community of democracies. That is to say, a community of democracies which is about a way of thinking of acting, about a habit of cooperation, so that the actual operational coalition will be different from issue to issue. It will not be the institution, community of democracies, the institution, NATO, not necessarily the institution UN, because you won't get there always with a Russian veto or Chinese veto acting in every case. But it will be the maximum possible coalition of relevant democracies to any particular issue. And by relevant democracies, we mean those in a particular region or with a particular thematic expertise. Professor Laffer, in his article in Daedalus in the year 2000, quoted Joachim Nabucco, I hope I pronounced that correctly. Brazil has always been conscious of its size and has been governed by a prophetic sentiment with regard to its future. That, I believe, was written in 1908, and I would love to hear from you how that prophecy might be realized in 2008. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We'll now open the floor to questions. I would just like to make one point in the absence of President Cardoso, because one of his main themes as president was the idea of a governance deficit. Facing the issues of globalization, he stressed on and on that there is this flux which is part and parcel of globalization, and that at the same time you do not have the institutions that are capable of dealing with all the dimensions of globalization. So this governance deficit was one of his key points as president. Yeah, and so that
my name is Attila, like the Hun, Andrade. Okay, and that's a good reminder, isn't it? Okay.
Andrade is the name of the Patriarch of Independence, so he has a good blend.
Okay, so again, I would like to congratulate you for your wonderful lecturing, very enlightening, very provocative. I would like to revisit some of your core ideas and thoughts, if I may, which will be divided in three major points. The first point being to perhaps suggest to you that, as you contrary to what you indicated, that the West seems to be declining, or it's already not there, if I understood properly, but let's take that it start declining. And I would like to suggest to you that perhaps that may not be so. Just occurred to me that a very famous German historian called Spengler wrote a book in 1914 called The Decline of the West. And this is in 1914. And yet, nothing of that has ever happened. So I would like to suggest just the opposite, that perhaps the Western power and values may linger on for perhaps another 100 years. And why do I think so? Why? First, because of the vitality of the American civilization. When I mean American, I'm talking about U.S. civilization, which is pretty much part of the Anglo-Saxon heritage, which has remained and persisted over the years. Your indications here seem to confirm my point in saying that 60% of the economic strength of the world, well, you just said this, but referring to U.S., at least 21% of the GNP is located in the United States. So I would like to suggest, if that is the case, chances are that that strength will remain. But even if that doesn't happen, in my predictions, and I believe it will happen, the world will keep playing pinball machines, will be checking the internet, visiting Second Life, and so on. And that's part of the economic power that the United States has it. The second point, even though the Anglo-Saxon American hegemony might be over in the middle of the century, say, let me suggest to you that perhaps the Western culture might, rather than disappear, might be transplanted to other parts of the globe. Let's take the BRICS. 3 out of 4 of those are pretty much part of the Western civilization and culture. Take it Brazil. Take it Russia. Let me remind you that in the 18th and 19th century, except for the peasantry, everybody spoke French. So that's pretty much part of the Western heritage. And let's take India, which has a strong British heritage, plus the American economic interest there. So out of the 4 major emerging powers, at least 3 of them are pretty much into the Western values and culture and economic influence. And therefore, I don't think the West will die away. It would only eventually be transplanted to other parts of the world. Now, another important factor is the...
I would ask you to sort of close your remarks so that
Yeah,
other people
I
can...
sure, it's because it's so complex, Sergio, that I need to
but I
put
mean,
everything together. I know, I understand.
everyone in this room has
I am
complex
summarized.
questions
I
to
will.
pose, so
I
would
apologize to you.
very
I
much
apologize. The other issue is precisely that democracy and liberal thought, perhaps in the last 200 years, it's only there in order to justify and making viable, palatable, the economic system that the Western world has chosen, that is, capitalism. Liberal economic thought could only be possible if freedom is there. So, if other world wants to be and achieve the same economic success of the West, it needs to follow the liberal political thought that is freedom. That's pretty much it. Thank you very much. I'm sorry for lingering on.
Yeah, maybe we should collect other few questions.
I'll leave Sergio, who is good at it, to ask.
So then,
Lourdes.
Lourdes first, and then Gilberto Dupas, and then
Well,
Boris.
Thank you for your very enlightening talk. I have a doubt which is related to the conception of democracy which is behind your proposal of a community of democracies. It seems that it is assumed, and you are not the first European which seems to assume that the non-European and non-American partners in this concept would share liberal values. So it is implied that it's a liberal conception of democracy. I share your I share your point, but my doubt is that some of the, not BRICS, but BICS, because you eliminated for the time being Russia, but some of the BRICS, Brazil included, as I am concerned, what you can look, you can see is that the normative values behind our path towards democracy are values which are not completely shared in liberal terms. I am basically concerned with rule of law and the conception of state. So the conception of democracy and the conception of state is not necessarily shared. So I would like to hear you. I think that I have very much in mind a similar assumption by Klaus Hofer, which I heard recently. So thanks very much.
Gilberto, sorry, Norman. Then can you wait to the second round?
Mr. Ash, like you said, we can designate, like liberal democracy, a political regime that, between other characteristics, guarantee a minimum of socio-economic patterns. Take Latin American situation, for example. Between 1990 and 2004, about 15 years, the number of poor increased from 41% to 44% of the total population. That means from 136 million to 230 million. That means an increase of about 100 million people, quite a double. In 1090 to 2004, 15 years. And expressive growth of violence in many levels in these societies. How to conciliate this situation with liberal democracy? In the case of South America, the way we found was new popular or neo-populist leaderships. The question is, if the actual global economic model tends to generate more exclusion in the underdeveloped country, with the exception of China and India, for special reasons, in your opinion, how to open space to consolidate liberal democracy in these cases?
Just one more question. What is, and then the word comes back to you. Wait, no, sorry. Boris? No, then we're going to leave Norman for the second round.
Well, I'll try to be brief, and I'm going to take an optimistic view, relatively similar from Mr. Attila Andrade, you said.
Yes,
okay, you are an entrepreneur, by the way.
I'm a lawyer.
Ah, you are a lawyer.
That's why I introduced the confusion.
We are, so in a way we are colleagues. Okay. Well, the optimistic note is that we have certainly a crisis. You dealt very well with this, the main features of this crisis, but I would dare to say that we are living in a world much better than let's put it's 70 years ago, for instance. No, the two worst. I think you certainly agree with me. The two worst regimes in the world collapsed or were defeated. You know, democracy is a value being introduced to a certain degree extensively in the world. We have certainly serious problems, terrorism, problems of migration, integration, violence, and so on. But we are not facing the same picture we had, let's put it in 1930, for instance. You know? So I think that the landscape is clearer than it was in the past. But I agree with you that it's impossible to reduce a perspective of democracy not only physically to the United States and Europe, but also in terms of value, we can't reduce to this region. I think India, even Brazil, Russia, I have many, many doubts as you, have an important contribution to rethink democracy and to reincorporate and refurbish democratic values in the world. At the end, I would say there's a good chance for that, in spite of all the problems. I would like to listen from you about that.
Well, thank you very much. It's a wonderfully coherent set of questions in the sense that they all come together. Let me start by emphasizing that I'm not some sort of Spenglerian cultural pessimist, preaching der Untergang des Abendlandes. Incidentally, Spengler, if you look at that book, which I have, look at it again, he talks about the Abendland as West European North America. He has a very restrictive definition. It doesn't even include Eastern Europe. Poland would certainly not have featured in his definition of the Abendland, but that's by the way. Hungary, possibly. There's a confusion here. There's a simple confusion. And it's intrinsic, because we use the word the West in these two very different ways. The broad cultural, historical, and the specific operational, geopolitical. And all I was saying was the Cold War West, which was an effective actor for 40 years, no longer exists. And on that I would insist, and if you want evidence, look at Iraq. Look at the Iraq crisis. I remember Lord Carrington, the former British Foreign Secretary, saying to me at the height of the Iraq crisis, he said, you know, if only we had Brezhnev back. Brezhnev made it so simple, because when the Europeans and Americans were at each other's throats, you could always rely on the Soviet Union to do something really stupid, and that would pull us back together again. And we have no more Brezhnevs to pull us back together again, and that's a fact. And so I can assure you that transatlantic relations now look totally different, very, very different, even though they're the same institutions and all the same professions of goodwill. It's a different ballgame. But that is a different point. My overall perspective is indeed hugely optimistic, and that opportunity does indeed consist in the fact that in important senses the West has gone far beyond the West. That in that world revolution of westernization there were very strong elements of things that, I mean, Amartya Sen would insist that these are not ideas uniquely of Western origin. He would rather insist that you can find 14th century or indeed 6th century Indian philosophers who have ideas of the rule of law and representative government. But nonetheless, it's hard to deny that in a developed institutional form, they did come to most places from the West. The question is, well, there are two questions. First of all, should we still talk about it as the West, as the greater West? Joschka Fischer has a book in which he argues for talking about the new West. I have very serious doubts about this. Partly because in many parts of the world it is seen as a sort of neo-colonial claim to say that these values are specifically Western values. And I'll give you a good example. India. If Amartya Sen was sitting here today, he would become incandescent. I've seen him turn white hot at the suggestion that these are Western values and Western democracy, which is being practiced in India. And so, apart from anything else, there's a prudential argument for not talking about this in rather offensive ways, as a triumph of the West, if you like, der Sieg des Abendlandes. I don't think this is useful language, or indeed necessary language, and this is why I prefer the language, the more neutral and inclusive language of a community of democracies. There can be an Indian democracy. There can be a Chinese democracy in Taiwan. There can be a Islamic democracy or democracy in an Islamic country. Why not? So that's point number one. Talk about it as the West or not? My answer, no. Historians, absolutely, but in operational politics. Second question. What are we talking about when we say democracy? And there were several questions on this point, and this is absolutely vital. And actually, several of us are involved in a series of conversations about the question of how empirically you measure democracy. What are your defining terms? I use here on these sheets in the end the Freedom House indices, which we all use because they're sort of, for years, the only show in town. I mean, they're the only people who, however crudely, have tried to make measurements, so that even the Arab Human Development Report actually used the Freedom House indices without acknowledgement. But they use them. They virtually do not have any socio-economic component. This goes to your point, sir, about the socio-economic dimension. They have virtually, that seems to me highly questionable, that you should exclude the socio-economic dimension altogether to your measuring, your assessment of democracy. They do include measures of the rule of law, which I think is very important. So there is a large question there, and unpacking that question, we have the following possibilities. Firstly, that you can have democracies, electoral democracies, which are in fact illiberal democracies. Fareed Zakaria's very useful term. Iraq is a classic example. I'm not sure if it's a democracy, but certainly it's not a liberal democracy, which does not have the rule of law, does not have respect for human and particularly minority rights, which produces a tyranny of the majority, and in fact, far from having the benign Kantian effect of promoting peace between nations, actually is a motor and catalyst of inter-ethnic strife and warfare, because the minority reaches for the gun. So that's number one, illiberal democracy. Number two, and here I forget who it was who said this, when we're talking, yes, I think it was you, sir, talking about the BRICS. You can have undemocratic capitalism. I mean, the fact is that certainly in China today, I mean, someone nicely calls it Leninist capitalism, you have a combination of a ruling single communist party and what is by any credible definition capitalism. And I don't accept the view, which is the Ned Phelps view, that unless it goes with liberal democracy, it's not really capitalism. No, there is private ownership, there is capital, there is profit maximizing, there are all the key features that Marx would have recognized of capitalism, but it's undemocratic capitalism. And actually in Russia, to a significant degree, not to the same degree, you have at least pretty undemocratic capitalism. So the proposition before us, which is being tested before our eyes, is whether you can have a stable system, rather than a transitional system, which is capitalist but not democratic. And if the answer we get back from China and Russia in 10 or 15 years' time is yes, then we're in a different world, which is not a liberal democratic world. So that's the second big test case. The third big test case is the one you raised, and this is another reason I'm in Brazil, which is, can you genuinely sustain a liberal democracy given such extremes of poverty and social exclusion and drugs and crime and inequality? And that, it seems to me, is, if I may say so, it's a Brazilian question, and a question not only in Brazil. And I'm very interested in how Brazil is addressing that question, because of course I want the answer to be yes. I want the answer to be that Brazil is showing us that you don't have to go down the neo-populist route, you don't have to be Hugo Chavez, that you can find solutions within the prevailing political system. In parenthesis, I think it's an interesting question whether the key issue here is inequality or simply poverty and social exclusion. I don't know the answer to this. There's a very interesting work done going to ask the poor what the real problem is. And the answer is not always, our problem is that other people are very rich. That is not necessarily. The poor in America, for example, don't mind other people being very rich. The poor in America are against high taxes on the rich because they think they might be rich one day. Right? A friend of mine, Richard Sennett, did a study among workers in Britain. Inequality is not at the top of the list. They don't mind people being mega rich, particularly if they're celebrities or good footballers. Footballers can be as rich as you like. That's a universal human view, I think. I don't know what the position is in Brazil. I'd be interested to hear. But I'm not myself convinced that inequality in itself is the key to the matter. The key to the matter seems to me a certain social minimum of economic well-being and basic social and legal security. Legal security, too. Security from arbitrary violence, which is, it seems to me, a necessary condition of a flourishing liberal democracy. And if you don't achieve that over a significant period of time, I suspect, and you're right, sir, that you will get a challenge to liberal democracy itself. Now, put together those three kinds of large areas of challenge: illiberal democracy, particularly in multi-ethnic societies, undemocratic capitalism in two of the largest economies in the world, and, as it were, the neo-populist or neo-authoritarian temptation in countries with extreme poverty. If all three go wrong, the future for liberal democracy does not look very rosy.
Okay, let's go for a second round of questions. First Norman, then wait a second. First Norman, then Oscar, then Helga Juarez, and you, and then we'll finish.
In order, I'm following this one.
I would agree with you in general terms that I've come to believe that the forces of cooperation are much more powerful than the forces of dissolution. If not, civilization would not exist. I've been working in Latin America for 46 years. I've been living in Sao Paulo for 30 years, and I'm a Brazilian citizen. I see great improvements in Latin America. I can point to some examples. I mean, the fact that Chile has emerged from the Pinochet nightmare, that Peru, for example, has survived a major guerrilla insurrection, a hyperinflation, a cholera epidemic, and a dictatorship, to organize itself sufficiently to be investment grade in financial markets today. That the level of violence in Colombia is reducing and society is consolidating. With all of these, and the progress in Brazil, I mean, Brazil is, it's a very interesting. Brazil is a country of aspiration, but it is not a country of ambition. And I would like to make the distinction between the two, because if Brazil were a more ambitious country, it would solve its problem in education, which we have been working on at our institute. It would solve the problem of the disorder and the corruption in political life. It would set a rule that behavior has consequences. And in our political life, and in many of the emissions of our society, behavior does not have consequences. I think that when you talk about cooperation, you have to talk about the danger of regressive behavior. You have this kind of regressive behavior is occurring all over the world. It's certainly occurring in the Middle East. We have, in Latin America, we have the problem of Mexico. Mexico is a great country which only collects 11% of its GDP in taxes, and its oil reserves are becoming exhausted very rapidly. Venezuela also is declining in its oil production, which will change the geopolitical equation in Latin America in coming years. I think that the problem that we face is that these societies have to come together. And when you talk about, I think that you're saying that the West, in the Cold War sense, is not, is basically invalid anymore. I think that you have the problem, basically, an administration which has been a disaster is ending in the United States. The Iraq War is ending is ending one way or the other, and there will be a regrouping of forces that are much more constructive than they appear to be today. Yeah, I'm finishing. I never speak at length. But I think that I think there's a lot of mythology about this. I think that the idea of the BRICS is an invention of financial markets. I think that the disparities between these four countries are so great that there is absolutely no coherence in this. And I think that this is a false view of the world. But I think that basically we in Brazil, and Brazil is basically a Western society, that we have to worry about our internal coherence and also the consequences of our behavior. Thank you.
Then we go to Skip Oscar. Really? Okay, then we go to Elga. Yeah, but please keep it short.
This is discrimination.
Don't you? No, this is positive discrimination.
That's
anti-Western.
Well, then no prolegomena. I want to go further. You raised the issue of the relationship between capitalism and democracy, and you say give them a test, 10, 15 years. Well, I think the spread of capitalism was a question of centuries and not 10, 15 years, and it went together with the formation of Western between inverted commas democracy. So for me, the collapse of the Soviet Union was not a collapse of a political system. It was a collapse of an economic system. And it means the spreading of capitalism to Eastern Europe, but it goes slowly, and the spread of capitalism to China. And one sees in China already some rumblings of some degree of small and gradual political liberalization. So I think 10 to 15 years is not the test. And at least that's my optimistic view, is that the spread of capitalism will bring also the spread of liberal democracy. And in your scheme, somehow, I think you would have to relate more than you did the question of capitalism and democracy to close it. I thought it was a beautiful view of how the world is and is evolving, but the economic part was out.
So let's give them 50 years.
I
Juarez.
don't know how many years.
Trying to put my question, the meaning of my question first. I take almost all the positions of Garton Ash as in his exposition first, and then in the answer to the positions of others. I would take as very reasonable. And the big question then, I would say, is the imprevisible, especially is very reasonable, especially on the economic social level. I think it's quite more certain what's going to be happen in the I think it's 2 generations perhaps, 25, 30 years. Is the directions is there. Whether it's going to be quicker, whether it's going to have the way it's going to the transformation is going to be. Well, these are minor in this discussion, minor issues. The big issue is to say what are the chances of liberal democracy vis-à-vis other kinds of political systems in a world in which, let's look 30 years or 40, I don't know, in which China and India, quite certainly Brazil is going to will be big economies, not per capita economies, but big capitalist economies. And I think it's much less foreseeable which side is going to win. In this arena 30 years from now, they are going to be overcoming or getting even in the size of the United States economy. So that you're going to have, as far as richness are concerned, economic richness, bipolar world, to see what's going to happen in the political, especially the acting entities. It's very bad. We are going to have a global economy by then. But what kind of values, what kind of political entity is going to emerge? I would make an argument that, well, that's beyond our means of foreseeing things. I would like to, I'm not very certain about this, I would like to have your opinion on this.
I'm Jaime Areizaga. I've been here, living here in Brazil for 8 years. I went to Stanford Law School, and I work as an attorney, and I'm just getting ready to go back to the States, to Washington, to be a White House fellow. I think just very few comments here quickly. One is, I think we cannot underestimate the importance of the UN. Even though it's not a perfect institution, I think it is definitely the institution of choice and the established institution. So I think that minimizing the role of the UN and looking at these other institutions you've mentioned, I think that UN is going to be around, it's going to play a role, and I don't see a major reform of it happening, but I do think that the new issues after 2009, the UN will be the forum of choice for discussion. I do agree with you that we'll have a multipolar, if we're not already in a multipolar world, I think that that's going to be the situation. But as you indicated, the major countries, as we have all discussed around the table, concentrate in Europe and the US. So I do agree with you that that's the starting point. I think the nation state it's here to stay. So it's very difficult when we look at international governance to look at a way to integrate it other than in Europe because of the preeminence of the nation state. And just one last point and a question is, you mentioned the position of Senator McCain looking to the future. We are coming into elections next year, and I think conventional wisdom is that after 8 years of a very difficult period, the Democrats should have a bigger chance of taking over the White House next year. What is your view as to what philosophy are those Democrats which, after 8 years of a transformation of the world, will have to come in to lead the U.S. And to propose a plan after 8 years of unilateral failure? I don't know if you want to guess on specifically Senator Clinton or Senator Obama, but where do you see the Democrats taking the U.S. in that new, in what we hope it's going to be a free world? Thank you.
Very brief one.
Roberto Teixeira da Costa, I had the pleasure to meet you in Davos, and I'm very pleased to see you again. You mentioned globalization as a fact in nowadays life. To what extent the failure of the Doha round, the failure of Mr. Bush to get a new mandate for Trade Promotion Authority, to what extent this world being more protective than ever is going to affect or jeopardize globalization?
Well, thank you very much. Who was it who said, I never make predictions, especially about the future? To your comments, I'd just say one thing very briefly, which is that for all the sort of celebration of the new international politics of globalization, transnational actors of various kinds, transnational, that's it. There is no substitute for the state, the well-functioning state. And a lot of these issues actually come back to the basic functioning of the state, whose first function, let me remind you, after Max Weber, is the monopoly of organized violence. The monopoly of organized violence. Well, you know about that. But we know about it in the Balkans. We know about it in the Balkans in spades in a different form, and there is still no substitute for the absolute core functions of the state. And having said I won't make any predictions, I mean, I think we'll still be living in a world of states in 30 and 40 and 50 years' time, whatever other component elements there are. Organized violence, Gewalt. Secondly, to the question about inviting me to make large visionary predictions, I think Francis Fukuyama is much more right than Sam Huntington. I think Sam Huntington is dangerously wrong in The Clash of Civilizations, and Fukuyama is much more interestingly right. That is to say, we do live in a world which is different from the world in which I grew up, in which there are no major ideological alternatives with broad international appeal, which propose different fundamental visions of the organization of society. And that was Fukuyama's point. Islamism, which is kind of offered up as that alternative, just isn't. I mean, first of all, it's not an option for anyone who isn't a Muslim, but it's actually not an option for most Muslims either, you know. Whereas, so Islamofascism is a very misleading term in many respects, but also in that one. Whereas for most of the 20th century, let us not forget that three major ideological alternatives, fascism, communism, and liberal democracy, competed for the affections of hundreds of millions of people around the world. And I don't see that alternative. My crystal ball doesn't see that far. But at the moment we live in a world without that alternative. We are talking about variants of capitalism, and this comes back to your point about the relationship between capitalism and democracy. And very briefly, I would just say it's worth reading Karl Marx. It is worth reading Karl Marx. The essence of communism is the abolition of private property. The essence of capitalism is the presence of private property and the profit-maximizing interests of capitalists. What is the key element here? For Marx, there was something called bourgeois democracy. I think he was right. I think that, and others, Barrington Moore and others, have made the argument subsequently. I think that one of the key elements in consolidating liberal democracy is indeed a strong bourgeoisie. A strong bourgeoisie. Why was the transition in Spain so almost laughably easy? Because you had an immense and powerful bourgeoisie in a capitalist economy already in place. And democracy was more or less topping the house out. It was putting the roof on. And therefore, I am all along optimistic about China for one reason. China is very poor in resources. It does not have the resource curse. If you have the resource curse, if you are as rich in oil and gas as Saudi Arabia or Russia, then I think you can go on for quite a long time in a fairly undemocratic way. These are the great exceptions to the rule. And so it is, I think, a message of enormous hope that China is poor in resources and therefore actually has to make things, has to give property rights. China is at this moment just beginning to secure property rights, and therefore I see hope for the emergence of a bourgeoisie. Finally, to you, sir, just to be clear, first port of call, default position. Can we do it with the UN? Can we do it according to international law? I merely say to you, there are very important challenges where that ain't going to be possible. Let me give you one example, Kosovo, where having allowed a genocide to happen in Bosnia, we were faced with the beginnings of a new genocide in Kosovo, and we couldn't get a resolution through the UN Permanent Security Council because Russia blocked it, right? Should we not have acted because we did not have authority under the UN and under international law? I think not. I think we were right to act. Someone said the Kosovo intervention was illegal but legitimate. Illegal but legitimate, and I hold to that. And we are going to face quite a few situations in the world where you're not going to get UN authority, however hard you try. And then the question is, what do you do about it? And this is where the Kantian ideal of the community of democracies come in, because that gives you a level of significant legitimacy, even if it's short of international law. Final point, as we hit 12 noon. Let's play the game that the whole world plays. Actually, it's the penultimate point, and speculate about what happens next in Washington. And by the way, it is, the world we're in. Wherever I go, anywhere in Europe, Egypt, Taiwan, you name it, the one thing everybody asks about and everybody knows about is American politics. It is the world theater of politics. So I followed it very closely. I just followed the presidential debates. I am worried by what I hear from the Democrats, because I fear that rather than moving from, as it were, conservative unilateralism to liberal internationalism, we may see them moving to a rather defensive, inward-looking posture, which says, well, if the world doesn't want us to intervene, then we'll look after ourselves. There's always the isolationist temptation, and I see elements of that. That's your ordinary Joe in the Midwest reaction to Iraq. Well, you know, let's not do that again. Let's not get involved anywhere. Plus, very strong trade protectionism, and this goes to your question about the Doha round. Is there a danger of a new protectionism? Absolutely there is. You only have to listen to Lou Dobbs on CNN. And the way in which free trade is being scapegoated for the loss of American jobs short term, essentially to the Far East and to, you know, cheap wage economies, is, I think, very worrying. So I will be very worried that rather than being a liberal internationalism, you would have a kind of liberal, defensive, protectionist posture. And that brings me to my final point, which is, and this is why I've enjoyed this conversation, I think it's a pity that the rest of us in the world are basically consumers of American ideas and American proposals. And this is not in any way, I don't have an anti-American nerve in my body, I really don't. It's not an anti-American remark, it's just a pity that wherever you go, you're talking about what the American presidential candidates are doing and what Fukuyama wrote or what Robert Kagan wrote or what Huntington wrote. And I would like us, whether it's in Europe or in Brazil, now and then to come up with a few ideas of our own, because I think we have something else to contribute. Thank you.
I'd like to thank you very much for a most stimulating discussion that you have provided us. I think I speak on behalf of all and hope we'll continue to pursue these discussions in the future. Agradeço a presença de todos. Muito obrigado.